It's not often that a young individual writes a best-selling book for other young individuals. And this book had a little bit of a trial and error before it got in the hands of its audience. But when it did, oh my goodness, did it take off. So welcome to Book Bites and another pick from the Dragons. Hi, everybody. It's Gretchen Shepherd again with Book Bites from the Booklady. And tonight, the Dragons have chosen once again. And tonight's book is a book you may be familiar with the movie that came out about it. So-and-so I thought on the movie, but the book was one of my favorites. The book is called Eragon, and it is by Christopher Paolini. And when Eragon hit the shelves, it hit with just an amazing, oh my gosh, it was such a big hit and amongst the kids, but it was not easy to get published. This, as the story goes, that I know now, you can fact check, it's probably got holes in it all over the place, but Christopher Paolini wrote this book when he was 15. He tried to get it published, and it was rejected. His parents were both educators, professors in some field. Anyway, were really supportive of it. And they, in turn, wanted to promote it. So the story among librarians goes as that it hit the American Library Association, that all of our conferences as librarians that we have, educators we have across different states. And he started on the East Coast and going to each along, making a trek across the country, presenting the book at these library conferences with school librarians. This part I do know for real. When it got to Washington, and it came to the conference in Washington State near Seattle, it sold out so fast. The librarians went nuts. Everybody across the country was raving about this book. And the next thing you know, there was a bidding war to publish Eragon from the same publishers who had rejected it the first time around. So, are all those facts true? Are all those statements true? I don't know. But they're the story that comes along behind this book. And they're just as much fun as the book itself. But we're going to start tonight with book one of the Inheritance Cycle. The story is Eragon by a young author named Christopher Paolini. And it is a delight. Eragon. Prologue. A shade of fear. Wind howled through the night, carrying a scent that would change the world. A tall shade lifted his head and sniffed the air. He looked human except for his crimson hair and maroon eyes. He blinked in surprise. The message had been correct. They were here. Or was it a trap? He weighed the odds and then said icily, "Spread out. Hide behind trees and bushes. Stop whoever is coming or die." Around him shuffled 12 Urgles, with short swords and round iron shields painted with black symbols. They resembled men with bowed legs and thick brutish arms made for crushing. A pair of twisted horns grew above their small ears. The monsters hurried into the brush, grunting as they hid. Soon the rustling quieted and the forest was silent again. The shade peered around a thick tree and looked up the trail. It was too dark for any human to see, but for him, the faint moonlight was like sunshine streaming between the trees. Every detail was clear and sharp into his searching gaze. He remained unnaturally quiet, a long, pale sword in his hand, a wire-thin scratch curved down the blade. The weapon was thin enough to slip between a pair of ribs, yet stout enough to hack through the hardest armor. The Urgles could not see as well as the shade. They groped like blind beggars, fumbling with their weapons. An owl screeched, cutting through the silence. No one relaxed until the bird flew past. Then the monster shivered in the cold night. One snapped a twig with his heavy boot, and the shade hissed in anger, and the Urgles shrank back, motionless. He suppressed his distaste. They smelled like fetid meat and turned away. They were tools, nothing more. The shade forced back his impatience as the minutes became hours. The scent must have wafted far ahead of its owners. He did not let the Urgles get up or warm themselves. He denied himself those luxuries too, and stayed behind the tree, watching the trail. Another gust of wind rushed through the forest, the smell stronger this time. Excited, he lifted a thin lip in a snarl. "Get ready," he whispered, his whole body vibrating. The tip of his sword moved in small circles. It had taken many plots and much pain to bring himself to this moment. It would not do to lose control now. Eyes brightened under the Urgles' thick brows, and the creatures gripped their weapons tighter. Ahead of them, the shade heard a clink as something hard struck a loose stone. Faint smudges emerged from the darkness and advanced down the trail. 3 white horses with riders cantered toward the ambush, their heads held high and proud, their coats rippling in the moonlight like liquid silver. On the first horse was an elf, with pointed ears and elegantly slanted eyebrows. His build was slim but strong, like a rapier. A powerful bow was slung on his back. A sword pressed against his side opposite a quiver of arrows, fletched with swan feathers. The last rider had the same fair face and angled features as the other. He carried a long spear in his right hand and a white dagger in his belt. A helm of extraordinary craftsmanship, wrought with amber and gold, rested on his head. Between those two rode a raven-haired elven lady, who surveyed her surroundings with poise. Framed by long black locks, her deep eyes shone with driving force. Her clothes were unadorned, yet her beauty was undiminished. At her side was a sword, and on her back a long bow with a quiver. She carried in her lap a pouch that she frequently looked at, as if to reassure herself that it was still there. One of the elves spoke quietly, but the shade could not hear what he said. The lady answered with obvious authority, and her guards switched places. The one wearing the helm took the lead, shifting his spear to a readier grip. They passed the shade's hiding place and the first Urgles without suspicion. The shade was already savoring his victory when the wind changed direction and swept toward the elves, heavy with the Urgles' stench. The horses snorted with alarm and tossed their heads. The riders stiffened, eyes flashing from side to side, then wheeled their mounts around and galloped away. The lady's horse surged forward, leaving her guards far behind. Forsaking their hiding, the Urgles stood and released a stream of black arrows. The shade jumped out from behind the tree, raising his right hand and shouted, Garjala! A red bolt flashed from his palm toward the elven lady, illuminating the trees with a bloody light. It struck her steed, and the horse toppled with a high-pitched squeal, plowing into the ground chest first. She leapt off the animal with inhuman speed, landed lightly, then glanced back for her guards. The Urgle's deadly arrows quickly brought down the two elves. They fell from the noble horses, blood pooling in the dirt. As the Urgles rushed to the slain elves, the shade screamed, After her! She is the one I want! And the monsters grunted and rushed down the trail. A cry tore from the elves' lips as she saw her dead companions. She took a step toward them, then cursed her enemies and bounded into the forest. While the Urgles crashed through the trees, the shade climbed a piece of granite that jutted above them. From his perch he could see all the surrounding forest. He raised his hand and uttered, Istarili! Boatek! And a quarter-mile stretch of the forest exploded into flames. Grimly, he burned one section after another until there was a ring of fire a half-league across around the ambush site. The flames looked like a molten crown resting on the forest. Satisfied, he watched the ring carefully in case it should falter. A band of fire thickened, contracting the area the Urgles had to search. Suddenly, the shade heard shouts and a coarse scream. Through the trees, he saw 3 of his charges fall in a pile, mortally wounded. He caught a glimpse of the elf running from the remaining Urgles. She fled toward the craggy piece of granite at a tremendous speed. The shade examined the ground 20 feet below, then jumped and landed nimbly in front of her. She skidded around and sped back to the trail. Black Urgle blood dripped from her sword, staining the pouch in her hand. The horned monsters came out of the forest and hemmed her in, blocking the only escape routes. Her head whipped out around as she tried to find a way out. Seeing none, she drew herself up with regal disdain. The shade approached her with a raised hand, allowing himself to enjoy her helplessness. Get her! As the Urgle surged forward, the elf pulled open the pouch, reached into it, and then let it drop to the ground. In her hands was a large sapphire stone that reflected the angry light of the fires. She raised it overhead, lips forming frantic words. Desperate, the shade barked, Garjala! And a ball of red flame sprang from his hand and flew toward the elf, as fast as an arrow. But he was too late. A flash of emerald light briefly illuminated the forest, and the stone vanished. Then the red fire smote her, and she collapsed. The shade howled in rage and stalked forward, flinging his sword at a tree. It passed halfway through the trunk, where it struck, quivering. He shot 9 bolts of energy from his palm, which killed the Urgles instantly, then ripped his sword free and strode to the elf. Prophecies of revenge, spoken in a wretched language only he knew, rolled from his tongue. He clenched his thin hands and glared at the sky. The cold stars stared back, unwinking, otherworldly watchers. Disgust curled his lip before he turned back to the unconscious elf. Her beauty, which would have entranced any mortal man, held no charm for him. He confirmed that the stone was gone, then retrieved his horse from its hiding place among the trees. After tying the elf into the saddle, he mounted the charger and made his way out of the woods. He quenched the fires in his path. but left the rest to burn. Now that is the prologue. What was that she sent into who knows where? The next chapter, as it starts, is called Discovery. It begins just like this. I'll read just a bit. Eragon knelt in a bed of trampled reed grass and scanned the tracks with a practiced eye. The prince told him that a deer had been in the meadow only half an hour before. Soon they would bed down. His target, a small doe with a pronounced limp in her left forefoot, was still with the herd. He was amazed she had made it so far without a wolf or bear catching her. The sky was clear and dark, and a slight breeze stirred the air. A silvery cloud drifted over the mountains that surrounded him, its edges glowing with ruddy light cast from the harvest moon cradled between two peaks. Streams flowed down the mountains from stolid glaciers and glistening snowpacks. A brooding mist crept along the valley's floor almost thick enough to obscure his feet. Eragon was 15, less than a year from manhood. Dark eyebrows rested above his intense brown eyes. His clothes were worn from work. A hunting knife with a bone handle was sheathed at his belt, and a buckskin tube protected his yew bow from the mist. He carried a wood frame pack. The deer that led him deep into the spine, a range of untamed mountains that extended up and down the land of Alagazia. Strange tales and men often came from those mountains, usually boding ill. Despite that, Eragon did not fear the spine. He was the only hunter near Caraval who dared track game deep into its craggy recesses. It was the third night of the hunt, and his food was half gone. If he did not fell the doe, he would be forced to return home empty-handed. His family needed the meat for the rapidly approaching winter, and he could not afford to buy it in Caraval. Eragon stood with quiet assurance in the dusky moonlight, then strode into the forest toward a glen where he was sure the deer would rest. The trees blocked the sky from view and cast feathery shadows on the ground. He looked at the tracks only occasionally. He knew the way. At the glen, he strung his bow with a sure touch, then drew 3 arrows and nocked one, holding the others in his left hand. The moonlight revealed 20 or so motionless lumps where the deer lay in the grass. The doe he wanted was at the edge of the herd, her left foreleg stretched out awkwardly. Eragon slowly crept closer, keeping the bow ready. All his work of the past 3 days had led to this moment. He took a steadying last breath, and an explosion shattered the night. The herd bolted. Eragon lunged forward, racing through the grass as a fiery wind surged past his cheek. He slid to a stop and loosed an arrow at the bounding doe. It missed by a finger's breadth and hissed into the darkness. He cursed and spun around, instinctively nocking another arrow. Behind him, where the deer had been smoldered a large circle of grass and trees. Many of the pines stood bare of their needles. The grass outside the charring was flattened. A wisp of smoke curled in the air, carrying a burnt smell. And in the center of the blast radius lay a polished blue stone. Mist snaked across the scorched area and swirled in substantial tendrils over the stone. Eragon watched for danger for several long minutes, but the only thing that moved was the mist. And I think I'll stop there. Yes. Eragon finds the stone. Is it a stone? Well, if you haven't read the book, then you'll have to find out what that stone really is. But it is a wonderful book. Yeah, the dragons are all happy that they chose this one. They always like this one a lot. A lot. So everybody, that's my book bites with the Booklady for tonight. Eragon by Christopher Paolini, an amazing debut book by an amazing young author. He has gone on to write several others. In the Inheritance series has, I think, at least 3, if not 4. He's written other books. No longer as young as he was, but still an amazing author. And for a debut book, this is well worth your time. So everybody, until next time, take care and keep looking for the beauty hidden in plain sight. It's all around you, but the first place you'll find it is when you go look in the mirror. And I'll see you at the next episode.